Changing this one camera setting has improved the quality of my images tremendously. I'm talking about changing the AEB, the auto exposure bracketing option, from 3 to 5 shots. To understand what I mean, I will show a few examples in a minute. You can also find this point in the chapters of the video. First, let me explain what the AEB setting is and why we use it for the newer photographers who are watching this video. Every scene we shoot has its own tonal range, depending on the given light situation, going from the shadows to the highlights. For us humans, it's usually easy to see things in both the darkest and the brightest parts. Think of a sunny day in the forest. We can spot the blue sky through the leaves, while at the same time making out details on the forest floor. Our eyes are just so good at this. A camera, on the other hand, is limited to a narrower dynamic range. This dynamic range defines the tonal range your camera can capture. Depending on how you set up shutter speed, ISO and aperture, it can either capture details in the shadows while blowing out the highlights, or details in the highlights while clipping the shadows. Keep in mind, different cameras have different dynamic ranges, so modern models usually come with a wider dynamic range. Also, the bigger the sensor, the better the dynamic range. This means full frame performs better than a crop sensor. So, going back to our forest scene, we will run into problems when shooting only a single image. We will either under or overexpose areas, which is something you usually want to prevent most of the times. To counter this problem, we want to expand the camera's dynamic range to include more of the darkest and brightest parts of the scene. And that's where AEB comes into play. You need to activate it somewhere in your camera menu, and it usually looks something like this. When AEB is active, instead of a single image, the camera will by default take 3 pictures. You will get a base image with the settings you have dialed in, plus a darker and a brighter image with a shorter and longer shutter speed. The difference in brightness between the base image and the 2 other shots of the exposure bracketing, if you don't adjust the camera settings, is usually 1 stop. And 1 stop increase simply means the amount of light doubles. So the image becomes brighter. 1 stop decrease halves the amount of light. Now, what we need to do with this exposure bracketing sequence is we need to bring them into Lightroom or Photoshop or any other image editing software and merge them together. There are different techniques of doing this. The easiest way is to let the software merge the images for you automatically. You will end up with a high dynamic range photo, or simply an HDR. As we have merged the images, we have expanded the dynamic range, making sure we have details in the highlights thanks to the 1-stop darker exposure, as well as details in the shadows thanks to the 1-stop brighter exposure. Using this HDR file, we can easily recover details in contrast-rich scenes through raw adjustments. That's the very basic version of exposure bracketing, which already brings up the image quality a lot. I have been shooting HDR like this for several years, never really further thinking about changing the AEB settings, because I was getting good results. That was until I was shooting this scene. My plan was to create a panorama capturing the whole cave entrance. The problem here is the huge tonal range from the dark walls of the cave to the bright highlights of the sky. I knew with a simple 3-shot AEB sequence I will run into clipping problems. I had to further expand the dynamic range. One way of doing this is to, instead of creating a 3-image sequence, I can set up the AEB to take 5 images. In that case, the darkest and brightest exposure solely contain details for the brightest highlights and the deepest shadows, even in a scene like this. You can think of it this way. We take our basic 3-shot HDR image and expand this by one stop for an insane dynamic range. We can take this even further. We set the AEB to 5 shots, and instead of one stop, we increase it to 2 stops, increasing the dynamic range even more. That's what I have done with this image, and thus tremendously improving its image quality, as I'm able to easily recover details in every area of the scene with just a bit of editing. This has been such a game changer for me that whenever I shoot HDR nowadays, I will always go with 5 shots at 2 stop increments. At this point you might be wondering, does this have any downsides? Yes, minor ones. We do need a little more space on our SD card, obviously since we take 2 more images. Also, in general, shooting HDR is not always possible. If there is any fast movement involved in the scene, chances are high these moving areas will look strange after merging the photos. That's because images taken with AEB active are a short moment apart, and thus objects moving may not align perfectly anymore. Classic examples for this would be leaves moving in the wind, waves, clouds, or in this case, this waterfall. Although it worked quite good in this example. There are ways of fixing these kinds of movements. One would be the deghosting feature in Lightroom, but unfortunately you can't 100% rely on them. You can try preventing this by shooting with a shorter shutter speed if possible. In turn, this also means shooting HDR with long exposure isn't really possible. Now let me demonstrate how I added such a 5-shot AEB in Lightroom. Of course, you can follow along by downloading the raw files from the link in the description of this video. So here we are in Lightroom with our 5-shot AEB sequence down below. This would have been our base image. You can see if I try to pull down the highlights, the bright area right around the sun looks super weird. The same goes for the shadows. If I try to bring them up, it just starts to look like a very bad image. And that's why we merge this into an HDR file. We want to select all the images down below, then right click, go to Photo Merge and choose HDR. Here, usually I don't change anything. I usually just check the auto align checkbox, and depending on if there are any moving elements, as I said earlier, we could use deghosting here. However, this is not necessary for this shot, so without changing anything further, let's hit the merge button. And after a quick moment, we will get an HDR file like this. Now, again, let me pull down the highlights, and you can see how we can recover almost all the details right around the sun, except, for the sun itself, because the sun is overexposed pretty much all of the time, no matter what. And at the same time, we can pull up the shadows to nicely restore details from those areas as well. What I want to do to edit this image is, I want to go ahead, bring up the exposure, and I'm going to raise it until we have some very nice looking details in the darkest areas of the image. Just right around here looks good. Now for the highlights, I already brought them down quite a bit, but I want to bring them down even further, and we can safely do this because we are working with an HDR file. Just right around here looks good. I do want to have some very bright spot right in here. I don't care too much about the details. I just want to have a nice looking sunstar area. Then for the shadows, I did raise them quite a bit as an example, but I actually want to bring them down a little just to add some more contrast to this image. Right around here looks good. Looking at this histogram, you can see there is a little bit of underexposure, but this is kicking in areas which are really not that important to the image. We can try to fix that by bringing up the blacks, and you can always hold down the Alt key to see where the exposure is happening. And as I bring up the blacks slider, you can see there is no underexposure anymore. So that's looking great. I also want to bring up the overall contrast of the image just to add some punch. And after adjusting the exposure, I also want to work on the white balance a little. I do want to bring down the temperature to have some more blue tones going on in here. And I think that looks great. We can also add a little bit of texture, some clarity, and a bit of dehaze to give this image a clear, sharp look. And of course, we want to bring up the vibrance and a little more saturation just to make this image more colorful. Right away, you can see the difference coming from our base raw file to the slightly edited version. The bright areas as well as the darkest spots are nicely exposed, and we have details everywhere in this whole scene. Using a free shot exposure bracketing, we would run into problems right around this area, and of course also in the very dark areas right here in the trees, because the dynamic range would not be high enough. So let's continue working on this image. From this point on, I want to add some masking, so let's head into the masking panel. And I want to start with something simple, so let's choose a linear gradient and cover the grass in the foreground like this. We can also say subtract sky to get a cleaner selection, just like this. And what I want to do here is I want to add some more punch to the grass. I'm going to increase the highlights. I'm also going to increase the whites. We can add a bit of contrast. And after these changes, you can already see the grass starts to look a little bit funny with some weird colors going on. I'm going to fix that by bringing down the white palette's temperature. And I guess I want to also bring up the tint to kind of neutralize that weird color cast. And then let's bring up the clarity, which will make these grass blades look very cool. Perfect. Now let's work on the sky. I'm going to use another linear gradient covering kind of all these dark clouds on the sky, And since I only want to affect the sky, I'm going to click on those three dots, choose intersect mask with, and choose select sky. Doing this will get rid of the tree in the center. Now with this selection, what I'm going to do is to bring down the exposure a little more, making the sky more dramatic. I'm also going to add a little more contrast here, and that should be enough for now. I'm going to create another linear gradient for the sky. This time I'm not going as far down. I just want to make the top part a little darker. So again, I want to get rid of that tree from that selection. So let's hit those three dots, go to intersect mask with, and choose select sky. And this time, to make the sky darker, I'm going to drop the blacks. This will only affect the darker parts of the sky, so we get some nice contrast in the very top part of this image. Okay, then let me create a sky selection, and then I want to subtract a linear gradient coming down from the top. Now what I want to select with this mask is all the bright stuff right here. And I want to select this because I want to make it warmer. And how can we make it warmer? Simply by raising the temperature. Just like this. Now the added temperature alone doesn't do enough for me. I also want to bring up the saturation so the color is actually visible just around here. Okay. And now let's further work on the trees back there. I want to use a radial gradient covering the trees like this. And I don't want to change the sky at all. So I'm going to say subtract and choose select sky. So what I want to do with the trees is I want to make them look brighter and give them some kind of light effect. Again, this is where the 5-shot exposure bracketing really helps a lot, since we can just pull up the shadows in here and create this cool light effect. Let's bring them up even more just around here. That looks great. And then finally, let's add one more linear gradient coming down from the top left like this. And again, I want to bring down the blacks, add some more contrast up in here. Could also slightly drop the exposure, but that's looking great. Okay, that's it for the masking adjustments. We can take a look at it before real quick. So here's the image without the masks, and here it is with the masks applied. As always, masking helps tremendously transforming your images, so it really helps to understand how they work. Now, after the masking, let's do some color grading. I'm going to start in the color mixer. Here I simply want to work on the saturation. I want to bring up the orange tones as well as the yellow tones. And at this point, the grass in the foreground looks super toxic, so I want to change that by bringing down the green saturation a bit. Just like this. And we could raise the blue tones very slightly just to make the sky a little more colorful. Okay. Now some split toning as well. I want to use the highlights in the split toning settings, add a warm hue to them somewhere around here, and just make the highlights warmer by bringing up the saturation a notch. Okay, I like how this looks. And finally, let's head down into the calibration tab. And what I want to do here is to bring down the blue primary hue, giving the warmer tones some more of a red color tone. And let's also bring up the saturation here. Wonderful. And finally, we can sharpen this image in the details tab. So let's bring down the radius, increase the details, add a bit of masking, and bring up the amount of sharpening. Done. And that is the edited 5-shot HDR image using Lightroom. So at this point, I want to say, although I'm shooting 5 exposure HDR shots all the time, this does not mean you have to do this as well. 3-shot HDR images usually, in most cases, are good enough. But if you want to have the highest possible image quality, you need to further expand your camera's dynamic range. Let me know what your experience are with HDR. Have you ever done this with 5 or even 9 images? Or do you have any questions about the editing? Let me know in the comments, and thank you so much for watching this video.